Whenever you are ready.
As an international student coming from a country rich with tradition and culture, I find it really hard to shift my behaviors and habits to match that of the United States. For example, because we had service tax included in our checks back in Malaysia, one too many times I walked out of a restaurant and then I realized too late that I forgot to tip my waiter or waitress. I know what you're thinking. Despicable. How do you sleep at night? I don't. I awake thinking about the horrible things I've done. No, I'm kidding. But my point is, after living so long in a different culture, it's really hard to change. That's why I'm so amazed when I found out that an entire country with centuries of culture changed in a matter of decades. I am, of course, talking about Japan, where before the 1850s, practiced a closed foreign policy for almost 3 centuries. And then after being in contact with the Western countries, changed in a matter of 3 to 4 decades. Today, I will describe to you the impact of Westernization on the culture of Japan. I'll do this by showing you changes in 3 specific areas, namely fashion, dietary habits, and music. One of the fastest and most noticeable ways that Japan has changed after having contact with the Western world was in the way that they dressed. As you can see here, this is Emperor Meiji and Empress Shokan, and that was how the civilians dressed before 1871. And after having contact with Western countries, well, actually, they were forced to have contact with Western countries. They saw that how powerful and how advanced the Western countries were, and thus began an era of rapid Westernization in Japan. This led to the biggest change in fashion in Japan that came in 1871, when Emperor Meiji made a public announcement that he himself, his court, and his officials would wear European dress. Once the imperial family shifted to European dress, the upper class began to follow suit, followed by any individual who could afford to do so. In this next slide, we see the royal family. This is still Emperor Meiji and Empress Shokan, but after in the year 1900, where they have now adapted to Western dress. And that is an example of how the Japanese people dressed after adapting to Western fashion. Following that decree came what is probably the most popular aspect of change in Japanese fashion. Their school uniforms. According to Immortal Geisha, as uniforms for government officials changed, so did the school uniforms. As you can see here in the boys' uniform, known as the Gakuran, they were modeled after Prussian military uniforms, featuring black jackets, gold buttons, and white plastic collars. And this uniform is still widely used today in Japan. And on the right, I'm sure all of you are pretty familiar with the sailor schoolgirl uniform that the Japanese girls wear, known as the seifuru. So according to Tombow Company, the largest clothing uniform manufacturer in Japan, this uniform came from scaled-down sailor suits that were worn by the children of the royal family in Europe and seen as adorable Western-style children's wear rather than Navy gear in Japan. Thus, it was adapted as schoolgirls' uniforms. In contrast, I'm going to show you the traditional uniform that the Japanese wore before 1871. And it's relatively similar between the men and the women, and this was known as the hakama, worn for more than 3 centuries, that's 300 years before this change. So, not only did contact with the West change the way that the Japanese dressed, it also changed the way that they ate. Westernization caused a really great change in the dietary habits of the Japanese. According to Alexandros Gasparados from the Biodiversity Institute of Oxford University, out of all the countries in the world, Japan experienced the most dramatic shift in dietary habits in the past decades. Their traditional diet of fish, rice, and soup has shifted into a diet of high meat consumption. So as you can see in this next graph, the blue line represents seafood consumption and the red line represents meat consumption. As you can see, since the 60s, there's been a steady rise in meat consumption. And in the year 2000 marks the first time in Japanese history that meat consumption has been higher than seafood consumption. So what is the impact of this change? Well, obesity in Japan has increased 3 times since the 60s, with the current rate of obesity at 20%, according to the Japanese Society for the Study of Obesity. Gozo Tsujimoto, the director of the Drug Discovery Research Center at Kyoto University, said that there's a simple explanation for the expanding waistlines of the Japanese. Lifestyle factors have become westernized, especially food, mainly transitioning into high-calorie and high-fat diets. So what is the proof of this transition? How about the fact that after the US, Japan has the highest number of McDonald's chains in the world, with over 3,000 of them in the country. Now that we've seen effects in fashion and diet, let's see what changes there were in music, particularly in jazz. So some of you might think, Japan and jazz in the same sentence? What is this? Well, surprisingly, jazz has been extremely successful in Japan, with over 20 dance halls opening in Osaka by 1924, giving Japanese musicians the opportunity to play jazz professionally. Jazz is widely known to originate in New Orleans, so how did it get to Japan? According to Professor E. Taylor Atkins, an East Asian historian at the Northern Illinois University and author of Blue Nippon, Authenticating Jazz in Japan, there was a growth in luxury liners going across the Pacific in 1910s, and when these liners would stop in San Francisco or Seattle, these musicians would get off and pick up sheet music, and that's how it made its way back to Japan. This theory is further backed by an interesting observation that he makes in his book, Blue Nippon, that in the same way jazz in America gave rise to the Flapper Girls era, the spread of jazz in Japan gave rise to what he calls the Modern Girls era, as shown in this slide, proving that jazz in Japan did indeed come from America. Today, UNESCO has named Japan as one of the largest jazz communities in the world, with Osaka holding the 2014 Global Concert for International Jazz Day. In fact, Japan also gave birth in the 1960s to one of the greatest jazz musicians that we know today, Toshiko Akiyoshi, who has received a total of 14 Grammy nominations over the course of her career. So we've covered how westernization has affected Japanese culture in areas such as fashion, their diet, and also music. Japan, undergoing major changes, managed to an extent to retain their cultural identity. And this is important for people of all countries to learn from, as in this age of globalization and modernization, it will not be an easy task to both go towards advancement and be true to our histories and traditions. Thank you.
All right, Nate, what did you think?
Well, it's kind of biased because I'm not an international student, but I'm not American. So I can definitely relate to a lot of the differences. Like when I go back to Indonesia every 4 years or so, of course, service tax, I've been doing that. And then how industrious most of the Malaysian countries have become. Like my grandparents moved to an urban environment where traffic is just horrible, just like we've seen China and Japan. So I can definitely relate to a lot of these topics and agree with most of them. And of course, his relationship to topic shows a lot of interest in how Westernization affects Eastern countries. For his topics, I definitely think he's spot on to a lot of his sightings. A lot of sources seem I won't say seen, but are I can't even figure that word.
Cited?
Not cited. It's like reliable. That's the word.
Oh.
A lot of the sources seem reliable with him describing the background of the source and who said it, and definitely the pictures also helped illustrate that change between Eastern into Western Division.
Okay. All right, Jack, I thought you did a really nice job starting off the speech. You had an interesting personal way of talking about the subject. The purpose statement is very clearly stated. You had an excellent layout of what the structure was going to be. Nice smooth transition from the start of the speech to the body of the speech. All of the supporting points seem to be pretty well developed. I did think that your explanation of how jazz became so popular was clearer than your explanation about why the diet changed, for instance. Your explanation about the clothing change seemed to be primarily it was a top-down sort of behavior, and the jazz thing seemed to be like it was, filtering in. And I'm just not sure why we got the other reaction also. I thought you had good explanations on those two. And you explained what had happened on the food thing, just not quite as much as why it happened. So it felt a little bit less complete on that section than it did on the other sections. I thought that you did a very good job visualizing the material. The clothes, for instance, are pretty straightforward and showing those changes. How quickly the school uniforms became the school uniforms, for instance, I think that could have been a little bit clearer. But like I said, you said, and these, they're still modeled on the Prussian officer's uniform, and they still wear these today. I'm going, and when did they start wearing them exactly? Was it like at the same time that the emperor decided to wear the Western clothes? Everybody made that change along at the same time. So I thought the visuals were really solid for the most part. There was one spot where it was a little bit awkward because you started talking to the visuals and instead of talking to us. But that was, it only happened for a short period of time, and then after that you got out of that habit, and I thought that was important for you to do. So most of my criticisms are just little technical kinds of things. Otherwise, structurally it was really good. I thought the summary was very solid. You left us on a clear point, and you had a good exit line. I appreciated that. All right, thank you.